report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Key findings. Colonial times forward, governments at all levels adopted and enshrined white supremacy beliefs and passed laws in order to maintain slavery, a system of dehumanization and exploitation that stole the life, labor, liberty, and intellect of people of African descent. This system was maintained by, and financially benefited, the entire United States of America and its territories. White supremacy is a persistent badge of slavery that continues to be embedded today in numerous American and Californian legal, economic, and social and political systems. In history and across the entire country, laws and policies, violence and terror have upheld white supremacy. Country, but particularly in the South during the era of legal segregation, federal, state, and local governments directly engaged in, supported, or failed to protect African Americans from the violence and terror aiming to subjugate African Americans. Government actions and derelictions of duty have caused compounding physical and psychological injury for generations. Racial violence against African Americans began during slavery, continued through the 1920s, as groups like the Ku Klux Klan permeated local governments and police departments, and peaked after World War II as African Americans attempted to move into white neighborhoods. War, African Americans briefly won political power during Reconstruction. States responded by systematically stripping African Americans of their power to vote. Lawmakers elected from southern states blocked hundreds of federal civil rights laws and edited other important legislation to exclude or discriminate against African Americans. These coordinated efforts at the federal level harmed Black Californians, particularly when coupled with discrimination at the state and local levels. Actors, working with private individuals, actively segregated America into Black and white neighborhoods. California, federal, state, and local governments created segregation through discriminatory federal housing policies, zoning ordinances, decisions on where to build schools, and discriminatory federal mortgage policies known as redlining. By the federal government, the California state and local government also destroyed Black homes and communities through park and highway construction, urban renewal, and by other means. Was denied education to enslaved people in order to control them. American history, when allowed schooling at all, Black students across the country and in California have attended schools with less funding and resources than white students. After slavery, southern states passed laws to prevent Black and white students from attending the same schools. Even AF to the U.S. Supreme Court held separate but equal to be unconstitutional. Children went to the school in their neighborhoods, so education segregation was further entrenched by residential segregation. Schools in the United States never integrated in the first place or were integrated and then resegregated. California is the sixth most segregated state in the country for Black students who attend under-resourced schools. Residential segregation, and compared to white Americans, African Americans are more likely to live in worse quality housing and in neighborhoods that are polluted, with inadequate infrastructure. Californians face similar harms. Financial assistance programs and policies have historically excluded African Americans from receiving benefits. The child welfare system in the country and in California operates on harmful and untrue racial stereotypes of African Americans. This has resulted in extremely high rates of removal of Black children from their families, even though Black parents do not generally mistreat their children at higher rates than white parents, and thus disproportionately suffer the loss of their families and the additional harms associated with being in the child welfare system. And state governments, including California, failed to protect Black artists, culture makers, and media makers from discrimination and simultaneously promoted discriminatory narratives. It's memorialized the Confederacy as just and heroic through monument building, while suppressing the nation's history of racism and slavery. Summary. Federal, state, and local government actions, including in California, have directly segregated and discriminated against African Americans at work. Policies like affirmative action produced mixed results and were short-lived. Americans continue to face employment discrimination today in the country and in California. Government at all levels, including in California, has historically criminalized African Americans for the purposes of social control and to maintain an economy based on exploited Black labor. Is an enduring badge of slavery and has contributed to the over-policing of black neighborhoods, the school-to-prison pipeline, the mass incarceration of African Americans, a refus al to accept African Americans as victims, and other inequities in nearly every corner of the American and California legal systems. As a result, the American and California criminal justice system physically harms, imprisons, and kills African Americans more than other racial groups relative to their percentage of the population. And actions described in this report have had a devastating effect on the health of African Americans in the country and in California. Compared to white Americans, African Americans live shorter lives and are more likely to suffer and die from almost all diseases and medical conditions than white Americans. Doctors have linked these health outcomes in part to African Americans' unrelenting experience of racism in our society. Physical harm. African Americans experience psychological harm, which can profoundly undermine black children's emotional and physical well-being and their academic success. Laws and policies perpetuating badges of slavery have helped white Americans accumulate wealth, while erecting barriers that have prevented African Americans from doing the same. Compounded over generations, resulting in an enormous gap in wealth between white and African Americans today in the nation and in California. Executive summary. Preliminary recommendations for future deliberation. Enslavement end legal slavery in California by doing the following. Language from the California Constitution that permits involuntary servitude as punishment for crime by passing ACA 3, Camlogger. Penal Code Section 2700, which states that the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, shall require of every able-bodied prisoner imprisoned in any state prison as many hours of faithful labor in each day and every day during his or her term of imprisonment as shall be prescribed by the rules and regulations of the Director of Corrections. Legislation that makes education, substance use, and mental health treatment and rehabilitative programs the first priority for incarcerated people. In addition, allow incarcerated people to make decisions regarding how they will spend their time and which programs and jobs they will do while incarcerated. That incarcerated people who are working in prison or jail be paid a fair market rate for their labor. For-profit prison companies from Oprah ing within the system, i.e. companies that control phone calls, emails, and other communications. Require that any goods or services available for purchase by incarcerated people and their families be provided at the same cost as those goods and services outside of prison. People who are incarcerated to continue to exercise their right to vote. Comprehensive reparations scheme, as will be detailed in the Taskforce's final report. The Taskforce's final report and findings to the President and the Congress with a recommendation that the federal government create a reparations commission for African Americans/American freedmen through statute or executive action. Request that the state of California and the U.S. federal government facilitate data disaggregation for Black/African racial groups. Terror. Easier to hold law enforcement officers, including correctional officers, and their employing agencies accountable for unlawful harassment and violence, including 1. A provision overruling the extratextual specific intent requirement that California courts have read into the Bain Act, 2. A provision eliminating state law immunities that shield officer misconduct, and explicitly rejecting protections analogous to qualified immunity under federal law, and 3. Provision for additional special damages when the unlawful conduct is shown to be racially motivated. Forms of expression, acknowledgement, and remembrance of the trauma of state-sanctioned white supremacist terror, possibly including memorials, and funding a long-term Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The value of black-owned businesses and property in California stolen or destroyed through acts of racial terror, distribute this amount back to black Californians, and make housing grants, zero interest business and housing loans and grants available to black Californians. Political disenfranchisement. Forms of acknowledgement and apology for acts of political disenfranchisement. Legislation that is in alignment of the objectives stated in AB 2576, Aguiar-Curry, and establish separate funding. Voter education and outreach. Add state funding and charge the Secretary of State office with making grants to county registrars for programs that integrate voter registration and pre-registration with civic education for programs that increase voter registration within the county's underrepresented communities and high school students. Legislation to prevent dilution of the black vote through redistricting. Require legislative policy committees to conduct racial impact analyses of all proposed legislation and require the administration to include a comprehensive summary. Racial impact analysis for all budget proposals and proposed regulations. Individuals with felony convictions to serve on juries and prohibit judges and attorneys from excluding jurors solely for having a criminal record. Segregation. Identify and eliminate anti-black housing discrimination policies practices. Individuals forcibly removed from their homes due to state action, including but not limited to park construction, highway construction, and urban renewal. Current banking and mortgage-related discrimination, including but not limited to discriminatory actions as a result of artificial intelligence and automated data analytics. Repeal Article 34 of the California Constitution. Repeal or counteract the effects of crime-free house ing policies that disproportionately limit black residents' access to housing. Establish a state-subsidized mortgage system that guarantees low interest rates for qualified California black mortgage applicants. Identify previous and eliminate current policies and practices that overwhelmingly contribute to the vast overrepresentation of African Americans among the unhoused population. Eliminate any policies with blatant anti-black residency requirements or preferences, invalidate and deem unlawful any contract with anti-black racial covenants. Maintain and secure public housing for vulnerable populations, including those persons who are formerly incarcerated, in the foster care system, and unhoused individuals. Development incentives for businesses that provide healthy foods, specifically grocery stores, in predominantly black neighborhoods to address increasingly prevalent food swamps. Unequal education. Black students to the existing 3 student groups listed in the supplemental grants Provi-Science of the Local Control Funding Formula, LCFF. Methodically guide this funding to provide instructional supports, enrichment, and counseling to black students. And eliminate racial bias and discriminatory practices in standardized testing, inclusive of statewide K-12 proficiency assessments, undergraduate and postgraduate eligibility assessments, and professional career exams, XSTAR, ACT, SAT, LSAT, GRE, MCAT, State Bar Exam. For free tuition to California colleges and universities. For African American/American freedmen owned and controlled K-12 schools, colleges and universities, trade and professional schools. Mandatory curriculum for teacher credentialing that includes culturally responsive pedagogy, anti-bias training, and restorative practices, and develop straight geese to proactively recruit African American teachers to teach in K-12 public schools. Arbitrary segregation within California public schools and the resulting harms to black students at majority non-white under-resourced schools by creating porous school district boundaries that allow students from neighboring districts to attend. Availability of inter-district transfers to increase the critical mass of diverse students at each school so that students are assigned, or able to attend, public schools based on factors independent of their parents' income level and ability to afford housing in a particular neighborhood or city. Scholarships for black high school graduates to cover 4 years of undergraduate education, similar to the GI Bill model, to address specific and ongoing discrimination faced in California schools. And systematic review of public and private school disciplinary records to determine levels of racial bias and require all schools to implement racially equitable disciplinary practices. Require that curriculum at all levels and in all subjects be inclusive, free of bias, and honor the contributions. 1. Executive summary. Experiences of all peoples regardless of ethnicity, race, gender, or sexual orientation. Hence the timeline for ethnic studies classes in public and private high schools. K-12 Black Studies curriculum that introduces students to concepts of race and racial identity, accurately depicts historic racial inequities and systemic racism, honors black lives, fully represents contributions of black people in society, and advances the ideology of black liberation. Identification and support of teachers who give culturally nurturing instructions and adopt new models for teacher development to improve teacher habits in the classroom. Improve funding and access for educational opportunities for all incarcerated people in both juvenile and adult correctional facilities. Them in environment and infrastructure. Identify and address the impact of environmental racism on predominantly black communities, including, but not limited to, unequal exposure to pollutants associated with roadway and heavy truck traffic, oil drilling, drinking water contamination, and current or former heavily industrial and other potential pollutants in black neighborhoods. And fund the statewide planting of trees to create shade equity and minimize heat islands in black neighborhoods. That state and local allocation of resources to public transit systems is equitable on a per-rider basis for methods of transit that are disproportionately utilized by low-income, urban, and black residents. Development of policies and practices that limit the unequal siting of vice retail businesses, example liquor stores, tobacco retail, in black neighborhoods. Neighborhoods to develop policies and practices that promote locating healthy retail areas, example grocery stores, farmers markets, within black neighborhoods. The work of community-based organizations in identifying Black resident interests and needs within neighborhoods, example, farmers markets, public transportation. The work of community-based organizations to ensure safe access to neighborhood-level physical activity spaces, example, public parks. Density of food swamps, i.e., high density ties of fast food restaurants in Black neighborhoods. Reduce climate change mitigation and adaptive capacity strategies and measures, example, cooling centers, increasing green spaces that reduce urban heat island effects and air pollutant concentrations. As community benefit infrastructure fund ing among Black and white neighborhoods, i.e. bike trails, drinking water pipes, sidewalks, etc. Apologizing Black families. Compensate families who were denied familial inheritances by way of racist anti-miscegenation statutes, laws, or precedents that denied Black heirs resources they would have received had they been white. Federal temporary assistance to needy families, funding devoted to direct assistance to impoverished families in order to provide greater funding to poor Black families that have historically been denied equal welfare benefits pursuant to a variety of subversive racist policies and practices. Severely disparate involvement of Black families within the child welfare and foster care systems. View and adopt policies that caregivers in the child welfare system are allowed to meet the requirements and have access to resources to care for family members. Black men and women have access to effective, high-quality, trauma-informed, culturally competent intimate partner and/or guardian violence treatment and services outside of the criminal legal system. Eliminate past due child support owed to the government for non-custodial parents. Collection of child support as a means to reimburse the state for current or past government assistance. All child support payments are provided directly to the custodial parent and the child. D2. Summary. Annual interest charged for past due child support. Incarcerated parents, when appropriate, to strengthen and maintain their relationships with their children by doing the following. Ongoing wrap around family reunification and maintenance services to incarcerated people and their families. Mental health support designed specify Cali to heal trauma and strengthen family ties, including both individual and family treatment when needed. Spaces and programs for incarcerated people to spend time with their children in non-institutional, non-punitive settings when appropriate. State prison system and local jails from canceling family visits as a form of punishment. All visitation policies be culturally competent, trauma-informed, and non-threatening for the family members. Free telephone and video calls to allow incarcerated parents to maintain connections to their children and other family members, for cases not involving domestic or familial abuse. Telephone and video meetings between incarcerated parents and their children's caregivers, physicians, and teachers to allow parents to participate in decision-making regarding their children's care, needs, and education. All over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. And eliminate anti-Black discrimination policies in the areas of artistic, cultural, creative, athletic, and intellectual life. Restitution and compensation to athletes or their heirs for injuries sustained in their work if those injuries can be linked to anti-Black discrimination policies. Individuals who have been deprived of rightful profits for their artistic, creative, athletic, and intellectual work. Identify and eliminate discrimination in the industries of art, culture, invention, sports, leisure, and business. But not limited to, ensuring access to patents and royalties for cultural, intellectual, and artistic production, prohibiting discrimination and glass ceilings that harm Black artists and entrepreneurs, removing anti-Black memorials and monuments, placing clear restrictions on the use of artistic works in disciplinary or law enforcement actions, and providing a pathway to compensation for student athletes. Labor and hindered opportunity. And eliminate racial bias in employment and advancement, especially for Black Californians seeking public employment or promotion to higher paying positions in government. Legislation to advance pay equity. A clean slate policy for both young people and adults to ensure that eligible criminal record expungements are done quickly and equitably. Unnecessary barriers to employment for individuals with criminal records. Minimum wage and require scaling up of the minimum wage for more experienced workers, require provision of health benefits and paid time off, and provide other missing protections for work heirs in food and hospitality services, agricultural, food processing, and domestic worker industries. Require or incentivize private and public employers to undergo training regarding bias in employment practices and measures to address bias in hiring, promotion, pay, and workplace practices. To support the development and sustainment of Black-owned businesses and eliminate barriers to licensure that are not strictly necessary and that harm Black workers. Fund intensive training programs that enable Black Californians to access employment opportunities from which they have been excluded. Employment practices that lock in and perpetuate historic and continuing discrimination and should make eligibility for public contracts contingent on elimination of employment practices that disproportionately harm Black workers. Disparities in transportation that limit access to jobs. 3. Executive Summary. To the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing and other relevant state agencies to effectively enforce civil rights laws and regulations. Unjust legal system. Discriminatory policing and particularly killings, use of force, and racial profiling of African Americans. And reverse the effects of discrimination within the criminal justice system, including reviewing the cases of incarcerated African Americans in order to determine whether they have been wrongfully convicted or have received longer or harsher sentences than white people convicted of the same or similar crimes. Security level determinations made by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in order to eliminate and reverse anti-Black discriminatory policies and decisions that have resulted in a disproportionate number of Black incarcerated people being identified as members of security threat groups, held in segregated housing, or housed in higher security levels than their white peers. Discrimination by algorithms in new policing technologies. Eliminate the racial disparities in police stops. Eliminate the racial disparities in criminal sentencing and the over-incarceration of African Americans. Over-policing of predominantly Black communities. The racial disparities and discrimination against African Americans in the parole hearing process, including in the criminal risk assessments used to determine suitability for parole. Both implicit and explicit bias in the criminal justice system, including implementing training and accountability for prosecutors, judges, parole commissionaires, and parole and probation officers. Of law enforcement jurisdiction within the public safety system and shift more fund ING for prevention and mental health care. In institutions that reduce the likelihood of criminal activity such as care-based services, youth. Job training and increasing the minimum wage. Board of State and Community Corrections, BSCC, CDCR, the Judicial Council and the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, and the Board of Parole Hearings to work with the Attorney General to collect comprehensive data on policing, convictions, sentencing, and incarceration, including the use of less lethal weapons by law enforcement and demographic characteristics on a regular, monthly, quarterly, annual basis. Data collection, mandate that law enforcement, at all levels, report the data accurately and in a time-ly manner. Require that the data be made available through an open data system that can be accessed and downloaded by researchers, advocates, policymakers, and the public. Physical harm and neglect. Anti-Black healthcare laws and policies, and anti-Black discrimination in healthcare. Both financially and with cost-free high-quality comprehensive services and supports, individuals whose mental and physical health has been permanently damaged by anti-Black healthcare system policies and treatment, including, but not limited to, those subjected to forced sterilization, medical experimentation, racist sentencing disparities, police violence, environmental racism, and psychological harm from race-related stress. And eliminate discrimination and systemic racism, including but not limited to discrimination by healthcare providers, inequity in access to healthcare, inaccessibility of health insurance, funding needs of health-focused community organizations, the dearth of clinical research on health conditions that affect African Americans, the underrepresentation of African Americans among medical and mental health providers, and the lack of race-conscious public health policy. Free healthcare programs. Provide ongoing medical education, particularly on illnesses and other issues that historically impact health of African Americans, provide medical clinics. ECAL reforms to increase flexibility for the use of community evidence practices designed, tested and implemented by the Black community and 4. Executive summary. It's the tendency to use culturally bankrupt evidence-based practices that are not field-tested, and eliminate the biases and discriminatory policies that lead to the higher rate of maternal injury and death among Black women. That Black women have access to competent, trained medical staff and services for all of their lifetime reproductive health care needs, including birth control, prenatal and postnatal care, labor and delivery, abortion services, and perimenopause, menopause and postmenopause care. Health Gap implement a detailed program of reparations for African Americans. Implement other policies, programs, and measures to close the racial wealth gap in California. Funding and technical assistance to Black-led and Black community-based land trusts to support wealth building and affordable housing. African American Freedmen Affairs Agency. Establish a cabinet-level secretary position over an African American/Freedmen Affairs agency tasked with implementing the recommendations of this task force. Agency is to identify past harms, prevent future harm, work with other state agencies and branches of California's government to mitigate harms, suggest policies to the governor and the legislature designed to compensate for the harms caused by the legacy of anti-black discrimination, and work to eliminate systemic racism that has developed as a result of the enslavement of African Americans in the United States. Agency should include the following: branch to process claims with the state and assist claimants in filing for eligibility. Genealogy branch in order to support potential claimants with genealogical research and to confirm eligibility. Reparations tribunal in order to adjudicate substantive claims for past harms. Office of Immediate Relief to expedite claims. Engagement branch to support ongoing political education on African American history and to support civic engagement among African American youth. Education branch to offer free EDU cation and to facilitate the free tuition initiative between claimants and California schools. Social Services and Family Affairs branch to identify and mitigate the ways that current and previous policies have damaged and destabilized Black families. Services might include treatment for trauma and family healing services to strengthen the family unit, stress resiliency services, financial planning services, career planning, civil and family court services. Affairs branch to restore African American cultural/historical sites, establish monuments, advocate for removal of racist relics, support knowledge production and archival research, and to provide support for African Americans in the entertainment industry, including identifying and removing barriers to advancement into leadership and decision-making positions in the arts, entertainment, and sports industries. Legal Affairs Office to coordinate a range of free legal services, including criminal defense attorneys for criminal trials and parole hearings, free arbitration and mediation services, and to advocate for civil and criminal justice reforms. Medical services for public and environmental health. Affairs Office to provide ongoing education related to entrepreneurialism and financial literacy, to provide business grants, and to establish public-private reparative justice-oriented partnerships.